Hey folks, my name is John Lay and welcome back to the channel. Alright, so in the last video we talked about the background information as to how South Korea got involved in the Vietnam War and how it affected the South Korean economy. Today we're going to focus a bit more on the South Korean military's involvement in the war. Now the overall assessment of South Korean forces that were involved in the Vietnam War varies from person to person and especially so over time. The popular narrative that's around South Korean forces was that they were aggressive and ferocious fighters, and indeed they were. It was not uncommon for South Korean military units to have a kill ratio of 20 to 1. In fact, the South Korean army just took months to secure an entire region that the French failed to do in more than 20 years. And also, the Viet Cong had a standing order to their fighters to avoid confrontation with South Korean forces unless there was a 100% chance of victory. The South Korean military quickly gained a reputation for being extremely effective fighters, and they were heavily relied upon even by the American forces. However, it's also true that the South Korean army was notorious for depopulating entire hamlets and villages for the loss of a single soldier. According to an old article from Time magazine, a South Korean platoon came under attack from small arms fire from a village called Phu Long. The South Korean platoon lost 2 of its members. In retaliation for the attack, the South Korean platoon called for artillery fire against the village. The village was leveled and 21 villagers were killed. But, according to rumors, it wasn't the artillery that killed the villagers. According to some of the rumors that were listed in that article, the villagers actually survived the artillery barrage. But after the artillery had finished firing their rounds, the South Korean platoon went into the village and secured the 21 villagers and then killed them on the spot. Now I keep saying rumors because this particular rumor never led to any sort of trial. There was insufficient evidence to suggest that there was any kind of foul play that happened. But that being said, where there's smoke there tends to be fire, and regarding South Korean atrocities, there's a lot of smoke. While it was common for South Korean forces to have a kill ratio of more than 20 to 1, there were also numerous reports that South Korean forces were engaged in what was euphemistically called depopulation efforts. Whenever civilians were killed, even if those civilians were women and children, those deaths were often counted as enemy combatants. And this led to unintended consequences. The deaths of civilians radicalized surviving villagers who later volunteered to fight for the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese army. So while South Korean troops might have been tactically effective, they might have been strategically ineffective. The excuse that is often given to defend South Korean forces is that they were under orders to minimize casualties as much as possible. Furthermore, the officers who led the South Korean troops were war veterans who had experienced combat during the Korean War. Either that or they were also trained by the Imperial Japanese Army while Korea was still a Japanese colony. The tactics that the South Korean forces used were the same kinds of tactics that were often deployed during the Korean War. Either way, what does seem to be true is that these atrocities that were committed by the South Korean military forces were not unknown, neither to South Korean command or the United States, but that these war crimes were tolerated because of how quote-unquote effective South Korean troops were. All told, while nothing is confirmed, it is estimated that South Korean forces were responsible for the deaths of anywhere between 8,000 to 9,000 Vietnamese civilians. But even this ferocity that South Korean forces were notoriously well known for did not last permanently. And that's because, over time, the US reneged on the deal that the South Koreans entered into. Before the South Korean government committed to deploying combat troops to Vietnam, one of the agreements that was reached between the South Korean and United States governments was that the United States would not reduce its military forces from the Korean Peninsula, so that they would properly be able to defend South Korea from North Korean aggression. However, in 1971, Richard Nixon was a new American president, and he had different ideas from Johnson. Richard Nixon had set forth the Nixon Doctrine. Basically, the Nixon Doctrine stated that as America's allies grew stronger, the United States would continue to withdraw troops from those allied countries. So, in accordance with the Nixon Doctrine, President Nixon withdrew the United States 7th Infantry Division from South Korea. This led to some rather uneasy feelings in Seoul. But even before the 7th Infantry Division was withdrawn in 1971, the United States was already beginning to withdraw its forces from Vietnam in 1970. The combination of these two events caused a lot of nervousness in South Korea. There was a lot of fear that the United States was wavering in its fight against communism, and there was also a lot of fear that the United States was trying to withdraw from Asia in general. This nervousness and anger was also felt on the ground in Vietnam. Although the South Korean army's involvement in the initial years of the war was highly praised, toward the end of the war, the US government's view of South Korean forces was mostly negative. Toward the end of the war, the United States State Department accused the South Korean army of being engaged in organized corruption. To be specific, what the US State Department accused the South Korean army of doing was of diverting US weapons and equipment away from the South Vietnamese army to ship them back to South Korea to sell those weapons and equipment back to the South Korean government. At the time, US Defense Secretary Melvin Laird was so upset with South Korea that he was considering fully withdrawing forces from Vietnam and South Korea simultaneously. Considering the fact that Melvin Laird also had presidential ambitions at the time, had it not been for the fact that the Nixon administration was mired in the Watergate scandal, and Richard Nixon eventually had been forced to resign in 1974, it is entirely possible that had Melvin Laird become the next American president, he might have actually withdrawn American troops from South Korea as well. Now, it is important to note that the atrocities that South Korean troops allegedly engaged in was unheard of in South Korea. All that the public knew at the time was that the South Korean army was engaged in an ideological battle against communism and that they were bringing in money that was badly needed. In fact, a popular song during that time was a fun melody called Master Sergeant Kim, who just returned from South Vietnam. And in hindsight, this is perfectly understandable. The South Korean president at the time was Chung-hee, and he was a dictator. The government under his presidency was not exactly a liberal democracy. The news media was heavily censored, and any sort of criticism that would have undermined the South Korean war effort would have led to jail time. The South Korean public never heard about any of these atrocities until the early 1990s, when South Korea finally democratized. Today, the Vietnam War remains an awkward topic of conversation to be had in South Korea. For years, the South Korean government denied that any of the atrocities had taken place. And as far as history textbooks in schools go, it doesn't really cover the depth of South Korea's involvement in that war. And unlike the relationship between South Korea and Japan, where history remains a contentious issue, the relationship between Vietnam and South Korea does not have that element. The relationship between Vietnam and South Korea has progressed tremendously since both countries normalized diplomatic relations in 1992. Today, South Korea remains Vietnam's largest source of foreign direct investment, and also a lot of South Koreans travel to Vietnam each year. At a time when Vietnam is trying to expand trade with other countries in order to lessen its dependence on China, it appears that the Vietnamese government has taken the conscious step of burying the past when it comes to improving its relations with South Korea. Because both the Vietnamese and South Korean governments are loath to talk about the war, it is up to civic groups to seek justice and compensation for the victims of that war. But considering the fact that it's been more than 50 years since the war ended, and many of the witnesses have either died or the records are damaged, assuming that there were even records to begin with, it's not exactly easy to seek justice. So alright, that about wraps it up. If you enjoyed watching this video, don't forget to click on the like and subscribe buttons as well as the notification bell. And if you have a comment to share, feel free to leave it down below. My name is John Lee, and I'll see you all next time.